Good morning, everyone. We are having our next event. This is a presentation from Professor Eric Uslaner, who is teaching at the University of Maryland. He's a world leading specialist on corruption and trust, and has been with us for, I think, 3 years now. And we are pleased to have him here and present on trust and corruption, perceptions in Russia.
Thank you very much, Edward. And thank you for having me again, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to be talking this morning about a project that is new to virtually everyone. I haven't talked about it anywhere else before. It is with a grant that I am working on with FAFO in Norway, and the Norwegian researcher Asmari Gorlan Lesholm, that you people may know of Norway. And this is a survey of the legal environment in Russia, sponsored by the Norwegian government. And my role in this is to look at the survey data on issues of trust and corruption in Russia. And I'm going to be reporting on this. So I'm going to be reporting on a survey of 2003 Russians conducted by the Levada Analytical Center on a grant from the Research Council of Norway. Can people see that, or is it too? I can't see it, so I don't know if anybody else can. Is it okay? Yeah. Okay. And so this is a nationally representative survey on issues of trust and corruption. You will see that there may be a couple of places where there are, actually more than a couple of places where there may be some findings that I should regard as at least tentative because of some issues in the survey. But there's not much I can do about that right now. So overall, let me give you a breakdown of the theoretical foundations of my work. And as Edward said, I've written on both trust and corruption. And my idea of trust is a bit different than what you'll see in most of the literature. It's what I call moralistic trust. And it is not based upon an exchange relationship or any form of reciprocity. Rather, it is a moral value that you learn early in life, stays with you over the course of your life. You learn it from your parents, and it is basically only based on experience in your early years. Later experience doesn't really shape this trust. So if you're talking about a Putnam-esque view of the world where people become trusting by joining voluntary association and learning to trust one another, that's not my idea of trust. This is a very different trust. And in my 2002 book, The Moral Foundations of Trust, I look at and show that the standard question in survey research, generally speaking, do you believe most people can be trusted, or can you be too careful in dealing with people, basically reflects this moralistic notion of trust that I talk about. And generalized trust, again, does not refer to anyone in particular. It refers to people in general. It's not about trusting people to do certain things. And it stands in contrast to strategic trust, which is about trusting people to do certain things, and particularly in contrast to particularized trust, which is trust in people generally like yourselves. Only people like yourselves. And with all the things that we've been talking about here of identity politics in Europe, and particularly now in the United States, Roberto just said me something about nastiness in the United States. That goes beyond what I've ever heard this group that you sent me about. But people who are very only in-group trusting are particularized trusters rather than generalized trusters. And that comes into play in Russia fairly straightforwardly. And I'll get to that in a second. Basically, the key idea behind generalized trust is twofold. At the individual level, it rests on a sense of optimism and control. The world is a good place, I can make it better, and I have the power to make it better. So this individualized notion of seeing the world as a good place means you're not taking a risk when you're trusting people who are different from yourself. At the aggregate level, societies that are the most trusted have the greatest level of economic equality. Because with economic equality, you can be optimistic, and also you can see that everyone in society sort of has a generalized stake in the same things. Whereas where you have high degrees of inequality, people view each other as rivals for limited goods. And again, economic inequality needs people to reject this notion of a shared fate, that what happens to you affects me, what happens to me affects you. And basically, what we know from identity theory and from my own work is that most people do have this greater sense of in-group trust rather than out-group trust. And in particular, religious people have higher degrees of in-group trust and out-group trust. Exposure to different cultures also show increased generalized trust. And this relates to the findings I'm going to report to you in a few minutes. Also, in this survey that we're talking about, I consider a couple of different measures of trust of people, but also of government, trust in government. And I think that I need to understand my own perspective on this, as well as the findings I will report today, is that these are two very different types of trust. You can trust your government, but not necessarily trust other people, and vice versa. And there's basically only at best a weak relationship between the two. Now, in Russia, distrust of others doesn't lead people to have little faith in the government. And we're going to find very different relations here between trust in government and trust in people in this Russian survey. Also, one of the main things behind this whole survey project is an examination of corruption, which is certainly a hot topic always in Russia, particularly with the Panama Papers. And let me then show how this relates to my general work on trust. In my 2008 book, Corruption, Inequality, and the Rule of Law, I proposed what I call an inequality trap. So it goes from inequality to low trust to corruption and to more inequality. Let me see if this is going to work. Yeah. How do I, okay. All right. I'm going too fast for my own good.
Yeah, it's working too well.
Higher technology is working too well. So what happens is high inequality leads to low trust in outgroups and more trust in in-groups. And when you have only in-group trust, you are more likely to trust corrupt leaders who will defend the in-group, saying that the outgroup is trying to exploit it. And that will then lead to higher levels of corruption, which in turn creates more inequality because corruption is a tax, particularly on the poor. Corruption means the government has less money to spend on social services. It means that corrupt leaders are less interested in spending money on people who may not be their supporters. And this whole thing perpetuates itself so that trust, corruption, and inequality all form this cycle that becomes very sticky and doesn't change much over time. And that's why I call it a trap. Okay, in most surveys of Russia, we find that about 25 to 30% of Russians believe that most people can be trusted. So Russia is generally regarded as a fairly low trust society. And in part, this is due to communism. Communism made it very risky to trust anybody beyond a very, very tiny circle of your friends. And the typical Russian response to the question about trust is trust but verify. I don't want to try to pronounce the Russian word because you all know them better than I do.
Доверяй, но проверяй.
Thank you. And Because if you have to verify trust, then you don't have this notion that trust is a moral value that sort of comes prior to any experience or despite experience. So let me give you my story about despite experience. So if I came and punched you in the mouth now, would that change your view of human nature?
Yes.
It would. Oh, I hope not. It would change your view of everybody?
No.
No. It would change your view of me, but not of human nature.
Well, I thought you were such a nice person.
One out of class of
Yeah.
nice persons. And that would sort of change my perception of human nature as well.
All right, well, okay. But in general, Chris, would that change your view of human nature?
No.
No. Okay. I need some support here. And the idea is, if you see something that gives you a negative experience, what that will do is you'll just sort of wave that away as an exception to the rule, that I might just be a bad person and the rest of society would be still, all these other good people will still be good people. So the idea is that moralistic trust, generalized trust, does not generally depend upon experience. But trust but verify is all about experience, so most Russians, therefore, are not generalized trusters. They believe that you must be able to verify trust. And here is, I remember I sort of gave you a little bit of a warning that something's coming that's a little bit strange. The survey that we conducted, even though it was done by probably the best survey research group in Russia, still found that 51% said that most people can be trusted. That is on a level with the Netherlands, which is one of the highest trusted countries in the world. So that leads me to be a little bit skeptical of some of the results that follow. I have no control over that, unfortunately. Oops, over that. So that leads me to be a bit skeptical of what I'm going to say. So if you want to tune out now, you've been warned. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough control over the survey document, so we didn't have any questions about inequality or optimism. But I was able to get aggregate measures of inequality for many oblasts from Sergei Guryov of Seal's Pole. I believe he's also connected to this university, is he not?
He used to be connected to the economic school.
Okay. But he was extremely generous about giving me these things. I mean, I asked him for it, I had it within 10 minutes.
He also helped us get the grant.
Okay.
Ron and me.
Yeah. So we all have good experiences.
Yeah.
And so I have aggregate measures that I can put into the model, although only for about half of the oblasts in the survey residents, and again, no individual measures of either perceptions of inequality or perceptions of optimism. Now, I was concerned about 51% saying most people can be trusted. And we had a series of other measures of trust, different groups. The generalized trust question, trust in the family, neighbors, supervisors, people in your church, co-workers, people in your clubs, people you meet on the street, other Russians in Russia, and other Russians outside of Russia. So what I did is I constructed a generalized measure that I call the radius of trust. Now, I cannot claim complete responsibility for using that term. Other people have used it as well. And why am I going? Marcus Freitag in particular at Zurich has been one of the people who has constructed these measures of trust, going from close associates at the lower end to strangers at the top end. So this is the measure going from 0 to 12. And almost 2/3 of the respondents have scores of 6 or lower. So this indicates that perhaps this measure may be more typical of what we should expect from Russia than the 51% who say most people can be trusted. And only a small share of Russians have extensive trust networks. 13% have scores of 10 or more. So that is a more realistic measure. So what do we find out from the statistical analysis of trust in Russia? Well, it's neither inequality nor change in inequality over time leads to generalized trust. And that, again, leads me to be a little bit skeptical of some of the survey data. But people who see more corruption now than 5 years ago are less likely to see generalized trust, to trust in others. And while there's no measures of optimism, we saw that people who see their standard of living as above or below that of average Russians were more likely to either trust or not trust. So if you believe that your standard of living is better, then you're more likely to be a truster. If you believe it's worse, you're less likely to be a truster. And this variable, people who see themselves advantaged, is actually the strongest predictor in the model. And interestingly enough, the tiny share of people who have lived abroad are much more likely to become generalized trusters. And the idea here is that these are people who may have experienced different cultures, who may have gone abroad with the expectation of learning from others. So we don't know whether this is because they lived abroad, or because they have the means to live abroad, or because they were looking for something in experience abroad. Now, for the radius of trust, religion is important. People who are highly religious are more likely to only trust in groups. Again, living abroad leads to higher scores on the radius measure as well. So again, exposure to different cultures matter, and these are the two strongest predictors. Perceptions of corruption and living standards, again, have strong effects. So if you see that corruption has increased, you will become less likely to trust others. And also, if you think your living standards are better, you are more likely to be optimistic and trust others. And again, I'm sort of puzzled by the lack of effects for inequality. Now, as opposed to trust in other people, and let me know how long you want me to go on before I stop here.
We want to leave maybe 20 minutes for
Okay.
discussion.
All right, I think I can handle that pretty easily.
Yeah, so we have about 45 minutes.
Okay. Unlike generalized trust, we see that Russians have a rather strikingly high degree of trust in government. And we can associate this with one major factor. They like Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin had a 78% approval rating in the survey. And people who have trust in Putin are much more likely to trust government, which is not surprising. We know from studies in other countries that trust in the executive is one of the strongest predictors of trust in government. And we see this very, very strongly in the Russian data. Now, something else that we see that's sort of interesting is that in Russia, Elena has argued very persuasively that what you have in Russia is a society of systemic, which is unclear law, unclear ways of avoiding the law or agreeing with the law. So the law is a very murky system here that can change from context to context. So we see that when people believe that government makes clear laws, or that when government sees that laws are enforced, they are more likely to have faith in government, which is sort of ironic because they don't necessarily see the law as enforced, they don't necessarily see the law as clear, but they like Vladimir Putin. So these seem to be sort of almost orthogonal to each other. But nevertheless, when people do seek clarity, then they tend to be much more trusting of government. Inequality also has an effect, but not so much on trust in government, but we also asked about trust in the legal system. And again, the greater the level of inequality, the less people trust the legal system. And particularly since many people believe that the legal system is biased against ordinary people and favors the rich. And again, let's look at corruption now, going fairly quickly so I can give people time for questions. Perceptions of corruption, not surprisingly, are widespread. Now, the good news is more than half of Russians believe it is possible to solve corruption. But more than 60% of Russians believe that all state institutions are corrupt. And if you go to look at this next chart, you will see that the percentage of people who believe that different institutions are corrupt generally is greater than 60% for everyone. The president over here is reasonably corrupt, but at the bottom you see local governments, parliaments, and then you see the major issues of the courts, the police, and prosecutors. So corruption is particularly high for instruments of the law, which is of course very problematic if you want to view the law as a means of enforcing anti-corruption. But here's the issue. There are only modest correlations between perceptions of corruption and perceptions of trust in government. And I don't know whether this is our survey responses, because I've looked at data elsewhere in the world, and perceptions of corruption generally tend to be the strongest determinants of lack of trust in government. So let's look at what we see here. Can you read this graph or not? No, sorry about that. Basically, I'll summarize it very quickly. Most perceptions of corruption are uncorrelated either with generalized trust or with trust in government. The major exceptions are judges being corrupt and the president, and to some extent the president being corrupt, but particularly judges. People are bothered when they see judges are corrupt. That is when they have less faith in government. And this reflects what Boo Rustin is arguing, that legal institutions, people have different expectations of legal institutions than they do of political institutions. People expect political institutions to respond to the people who support them. People expect legal institutions to be above politics and to be fair. And we see a little bit of support, although the correlations are not overwhelmingly high in these days. Sorry for the table being unreal. So again, perceptions of greater corruption are only modestly correlated with corruption in government. And the belief that corruption can be solved, and especially the belief that judges are corrupt, are more strongly connected to trust in government. And again, very, very low correlations between any of these perceptions of corruption and either measure of generalized trust, either the standard question or the radius of trust. So again, we have no real connection here in Russia between perceptions of corruption and perceptions of trust. And I didn't also find much relationship between inequality and corruption, so that's also a bit surprising. But there is one estimation I showed, the change in the Gini index from 1993 to 2010 seems significant for perceptions of corruption, but the coefficient is in the wrong direction, so that sort of struck me as even stranger. Now, for grand corruption, which is big corruption, corruption for elites, I did find a negative relationship between generalized trust and the belief that corruption is widespread. Now, this is consistent with what I found in my 2008 book on corruption, inequality, and the rule of law. People are bothered by grand corruption because it makes big leaders rich. Small bribes, the bribe you pay with the police officer, the bribe you pay to get seen earlier at the doctor's office, things of this nature, these do not lead people to become less trusting, largely because people don't get rich off these small bribes. There's no contribution to inequality from this petty corruption, and this finding is replicated in the Russian survey. So what makes people upset is grand corruption rather than petty corruption. And finally, people who trust others are less likely to say that corruption has increased. Maybe this gives them an optimistic worldview. And let's see, having an adequate income leads people to be less likely to say that corruption has increased. And in particular, people who have a European rather than a Russian identity are also likely to say that corruption has increased. So the more you identify in the in-group Russian identity, the less likely you are actually to say that corruption has increased. But very few people actually have a European identity, only 17%, which is hardly surprising. Perhaps outside of Germany, very few people have a European identity. Do you have a European identity, or do you say you're German? Sorry,
we are labeled a post-national nation.
Yeah,
So
okay.
Apart from soccer, yeah, I would also say I have a European identity.
Okay. Any Brits here?
No, I'd say European.
You're European. You're one of how many? Did you say European?
12.
Yeah. Okay. You're one of my five.
There's none now. There's none now.
So overall, we don't have too much support for my inequality trap argument. And I am not sure, maybe people who know more about Russia than I do can inform me on this, whether this is a particularly Russian phenomenon or whether it relates to sort of the screwy nature of some of our survey results. And overall, Russia is a society where people have limited trust, there is growing inequality, but somehow the linkage between the two doesn't seem as strong as even I found in my 2008 book between other former communist countries. So this poses a question for me, since I have not worked very much on Russia before, and I'm wondering whether this is a Russian phenomenon or whether it's a phenomenon of our data. But it strikes me as almost a little bit strange that the support for perceptions of corruption, of low trust, is not really linked at all very clearly with growing inequality. And I guess that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions and answers now. If I could start,
Sure.
while the audience thinks about their questions. I noticed, although you didn't say it out loud, but it was on one of your slides, that older people tend to be more trusting.
Yeah.
And I think this is an interesting phenomenon that reflects the difference between communism and post-communism. Because oftentimes people, I think you included, say that communism is responsible for the fact that people are not trusting.
Yeah.
But in fact it is the decay, I think, of the society that had more or less clear and generally accepted rules that contributed to anonymity,
Yeah.
and as a result, lack of trust. So therefore, you see those people who were sort of socialized in the good old Soviet period are a bit more trusting than those people who socialized in the 90s or 2000s. So this is one point that I would like to make. Another interesting thing that sort of I would like to react on is the difference between petty and grand corruption.
Okay.
And there was an interesting project that unfortunately I don't think has led to a publication, but I think the project was very nice. They distinguished between the so-called, they called it market corruption versus network corruption.
Okay.
And by market corruption, our young scholars referred to, things that are needed to make things work and are impersonal. Whereas network corruption is something that you need to know certain people,
Yeah.
and then things will work for you. And they have very different consequences in terms of economic growth and in terms of, I guess, also trust. And this is very similar to the distinction you made between petty and grand corruption, because grand corruption, in order to steer big, you really need to know people.
Exactly. Whereas petty corruption, everybody runs into.
Yes, yes. A question also, or thought, I guess not evolved in a question yet, but if a society is ethnically pure, like Japan, for instance, this is probably good for trust and the absence of corruption. But then this is an exceptional case, and it seems that most societies have to be diverse, and the degree of diversification seems to be increasing because of globalization and all. And this means that there is a lot more, room for right-wing politicians who can mobilize their populations against outsiders and be corrupt.
Okay.
So
Let me
this-
take issue with all these good points. Is this second paper you talked about, the second comment you made about market versus network corruption, is that available in English?
There is, yes, a progress report available in English.
So if you would give me a link to that, I'd love to see it. But I certainly think that that's correct. And in particular, I've had some discussions with some of my colleagues working on this. My Norwegian colleague sees Blot as corrupt. And I agree with Ned that it basically wasn't corrupt, it was a way of surviving, it was a way of getting by. But obviously there are people who disagree with that, and some of the respondents to our survey saw Blot as corruption. Now, some of this may reflect a generational effect. That is more now where people are looking back on it, they say, oh, how terrible this was. But people who were there and used Blot didn't necessarily see it as corrupt back when they actually needed it. And so I think this is part of an argument about the same issue. On the age phenomena, for most other post-communist societies, what you suggest is absolutely correct. That is, older people learned not to trust other people. It was dangerous. Now, I don't know whether the reason why I didn't make much of a statement about this is because I don't know how much I trust that relationship. In the West, many older people are more trusting. It sort of comes with age or maybe a generational effect. Whereas younger people tend to be less trusting. And so the Russian data support what we find in the United States and much of Europe. And it also strikes me that this is maybe a little bit strange, because younger people didn't have that negative experience of looking around and saying, is this a trustworthy world? They are more likely to see an open world now. And
But the level of inequality has increased.
that's also, but I don't find an effect for inequality, so that also strikes me as strange. So, but that's obviously connected to the inequality and why I find that older people are more trusting in most of the other survey data I have looked at for post-communist countries. And so I would exactly agree with you on that. And finally, rewind the last issue again.
It is about ethnically pure societies, which is, except in Japan and maybe Iceland, is a win, and this gives room for right-wing politicians to mobilize insiders against outsiders and get corrupt.
And my own work has suggested it's not diversity that matters as much as segregation. If the minorities are segregated, then this tends to increase conflict. But where there are actual efforts to integrate minorities into the large larger society, that tends to not to reduce trust, not to increase corruption. And one of the examples I use, and it's still mostly valid, is Sweden. Now, Denmark, which is also a case, seems to have slipped back dramatically. Iceland, I am not sure of now. We don't know whether this corruption we see in Iceland is restricted to the prime minister and a few of his other cronies. We had the same problem before with the Iceland economic crash. But overall, Iceland, again, is one of these countries that ranks very, very high on the Transparency International ratings. Japan is a different story altogether, because the more I look at Asian societies, the more I see a very strong in-group identity in these societies, because of the outgroup, people like us are seen as the other who don't necessarily have the same values, same characteristics as people in the society. And you really see this in Korea, where people with Chinese background are regarded as different. People in Japan, when they see people with Korean background, they're never fully accepted. So I think this in-group identity is very important in some Asian societies. And it's not just that you or I would look different to them, but even people from different Asian cultures would look different. And I don't think it's just simply a matter of heterogeneity. I think it's a matter of just having a very, very strong sense of in-group identity, which generally, the stronger the sense of in-group identity, the weaker the sense of generalized trust. And there is a really nice paper that is, I'm not sure where, it wasn't published anywhere in Asia, by Alberto Alcina, who looked at Italian survey data and found that Italians who have very strong attachments to their own families have weaker senses of generalized trust. So the more you are just connected to your own family, I'm not saying that we shouldn't love our own families. My wife would be very upset if I said this. But if you have an exclusive identification with your own family, then this will make you less trusting in general. And this leads back to some of the statements that Edward Banfield made in the moral basis of a backward society. And I know that's a very controversial book, but in that point, I think he was dead on.
I didn't know it was so controversial. It was always very intuitive to me. But that is really plausible because also with the segregation story, because the segregation leads to an exclusive identity.
Exactly. It means that you have no real contact with other people, and whatever views you have of other people are done not through any experience, but through stereotypes. And stereotypes generally tend to be very negative. Now, on Banfield, people in Sicily see Banfield as very, very negative. I have a friend from graduate school who's originally from Sicily, who once I quoted Banfield in my trust book, stopped talking to me. Is that strong enough for you?
Yeah. Well, it's understandable that people from southern Italy are a little bit more critical about this.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Chris.
Yeah, I like this notion of the moralistic trust, and what you imply is that it's a product of early parental socialization, for which reason you do not change this and over the reminder of your life course. I think it's a pity you weren't here the other day, because I think there's some strong complementary evidence to that. So Maria Ravlik, Amy Alexander, and myself, we're working on a paper that picks up where you and Boo left the field or continue to work with the historic roots of corruption. We look at good governance, so output impartiality as one dependent variable and generalized trust as the other one. And we also use the data you have been using from Fabrice Meutin, the 1870, so thanks for sharing this with us. Otherwise we wouldn't be able to do that. So this is also part in our regression. And that is, of course, remaining significant. We're not kicking this in any way out, but we have a complementary part where we think we add something interesting. We have, so many people think that declining fertility is a corollary of the Industrial Revolution, and many people are not aware that there were already pretty pronounced fertility differences in pre-industrial times. And this is what we are looking at. And it turns out to be systematically the case that those countries that introduced universal schooling early across the board are those who were on the lower end of female fertilities already in 1800. And we have some indications of gender equality in the household. And we argue that is the earliest experience of impartial treatment in the nucleus cell of society. And that turns out to be an additional strong predictor both of generalized trust today and of rule of law and low corruption and these kinds of things.
Now, that makes sense for a couple of reasons. The most important reason it makes sense is because you remember that particularly for the Western societies, to some extent there's only data only go for this, the von Hanen measure of land inequality, or family farms, is a strong predictor of widespread education. Now, what does that mean in terms of what you're talking about? Well, it's a measure of equality. And your measure of fertility rates are also a measure of equality. There's a measure of women's equal status.
Yeah.
Now, here's the second reason why it makes sense. Because you cannot have universal education without having women being educated.
Fewer babies.
Yeah. And if you go and look at, and you haven't seen my chapter on the United States, have I sent you the chapter on the United States? The chapter on the United States is based upon work that Claudia Golden and Larry Katz have done, in which they show that the United States was the first society in which men and women, or boys and girls, had equal levels of education early on. This was a specific policy, it wasn't an accident. So the idea that you needed to educate young girls at the same time you needed to educate young boys was a specific decision made to produce an equitable level of education, a universal level of education.
And also you had some outliers in Europe. I think it was Finland and Japan and Korea,
Yeah.
something like that.
Oh yeah, okay.
But they did successful catch-up
Right.
stories in education. And interestingly, those as well are on the lower end of fertility
Oh,
at the
okay.
pre-industrial time.
But of course, they all had huge, okay, they had external conflict, but also certainly South Korea and Japan, and especially Taiwan, which I've added in the news version of that final chapter, among other places, all had strong revolutions, internal revolutions, towards producing greater equality. And you must know Johnson Yu, don't you?
Who's that?
Johnson Yu, now in Canberra, he was in San Diego. Okay. He has a great book on corruption in Asia. And what he has shown is, again, the cases of particularly Taiwan and South Korea were marked by major upheavals in the society to produce a more equal distribution of land and at the same time of education. So land reform and education reform were linked, and in turn, these revolutions led to less corruption. So he came to this argument independently of mine, but it works. And Christian Gödel of Vienna also argues that for Taiwan.
That's interesting. Do you know the book by Samuel Paulson,
No.
Centuries of Economic Endeavor?
No.
He's a and he made many Western Europe, Japan comparisons. He actually invented the term contractual feudalism.
Oh my goodness.
And he said only Northwestern Europe and Japan, as civilizations had contractual feudalism, all others had what he called coercive feudalism. And he also makes a good point about land reforms. I think he also talks to these Asian cases. And he makes the point that land reforms that were fueled bottom up by upheavals
Yeah.
usually were much more successful than land reforms that were introduced top down.
So you need to send me that citation.
Yeah, I can guess it.
But you also know, well, sorry everyone for asking, you also know Sombars, heard of Sombars book, right? Oh, why is there no socialism in the United States?
Oh, I thought this was Lipset once.
Lipset took it from him.
Okay.
And Sombart was, I believe, a French socialist at the turn of the 20th century. And his argument was very simple. And he was a socialist as well as a sociologist. He was Bernie Sanders before Bernie Sanders was Bernie Sanders. And his argument was very simple. There was no socialism in the United States because there was no feudalism. So there was nothing for people to rebel against like there was here and many other parts of Europe. So the attempts to establish a socialist model here ran head on to the fact that there was nothing that strong to rebel against. Now there was a lot of inequality, there were labor strikes and labor violence, but still not nearly at the same level.
All right, we still have time for questions, and you're not, so far.
I think it's more of a comment than a question. Thank you. I'm not surprised that you didn't find a very high correlation between income inequality and corruption and trust. I don't remember where I've read that, but I think it was by Daly in Bremen. He did some research in Eastern Europe, and he actually promoted that idea that
What was this
generally,
again?
I think it's Daly.
Oh.
I have to check the exact publication. I have to check, but I think it was his idea. And
Pick it up. Okay.
basically, he says that acceptance for inequality in Eastern Europe is very high, thinking that people will be at the high end. So actually, that leads to acceptance of differences between classes, and therefore it has no effect on trust. I don't know whether that makes any sense to you, but I thought the idea is very plausible, actually.
Okay, I'll have to check. I mean, I do know Don now. I've been, but where I'm a little bit doubtful is when I had several chapters on Eastern Europe in my 2008 book on corruption. And I found both at the aggregate level and particularly in survey data, very strong connections. And particularly when I had access to a unique survey in Romania through my friend Gabriel Badescu, who conducted the survey. And he had questions on perceived inequality as well as actual inequality. And that was an unbelievably strong predictor of both generalized trust and perceptions of corruption. So I'm a little bit skeptical here because, again, I have found at both the aggregate and individual levels very strong connections in earlier work that I've done.
So the perception of inequality then is high.
Yeah. And particularly again for the Romanian data, it just blew everything else out. That was a major factor that inequality has increased. And I was very fortunate because he conducted the survey before we ever got to know each other. So I can't claim that he's set me up on this.
Okay. Yes, please, would you identify yourself, please?
Yes, Tim Bogowski, University of Tübingen. So, thanks a lot, very interesting insights. I have a question, maybe I didn't understand completely correctly your concept of moralistic trust in that way. You said it's built in early childhood?
Yes.
And probably not subject to change over life. I was wondering, because you found, for example, that if you see yourself advantage compared to others, you have a higher degree of generalized trust. I was wondering whether that might change during the lifetime generally, how you perceive yourself, whether being advantaged or not, and if so, does that then impact generalized trust? Because that would mean there is at least a portion of generalized trust that might change during lifetime.
Okay, that's a good question. Let me give you my general solution here. And it's not whether the question isn't exactly are you advantaged relative to others, but how do you rate your level of well-being? Better than average, worse than average, etc. I would imagine that for most people, your overall economic status does not change that dramatically over the course of a lifetime. Now, I will then contradict myself and say, yes, I grew up lower middle class and I'm now much better off than that. But still, I think for most people, their relative positions don't change that much. And I'm using this measure as a proxy for optimism, because we don't have direct questions on optimism. And let me explain very briefly what I mean by a notion that doesn't change very much. So, again, as I said to Edward, if I came and punched you in the mouth, would that change your view of human nature? Generalized trust is a view of human nature. It's not a view of you or me or any two individuals. It's not even a view of you or me or any groups. It's a generalized worldview that most people, including necessarily people who are unlike yourself, what they can be trusted. So in other words, it's this notion that different people are part of what I call your moral community. So it's a worldview that you learn early in life. And I have pretty good survey evidence from surveys of young people and their parents that one, these are highly connected. Two, they don't change much over time. The generalized trust question asked in panel surveys, especially in the United States where we have panels, is one of the strongest, most consistent, stable survey questions. It's even more consistent over some surveys than views on abortion. So people who say they are generalized trusters do not change their positions. In the most recent general social survey panel over a 6-year period, 86% of people gave the same answer from year 1 to year 6. That's amazing. So this is a very stable set of views, very worldviews. And it's not likely to be changed by any experience you have. Whether you have a good experience by joining a club, you have a bad experience by being divorced or robbed or anything like that, that does not change your worldview.
I guess,
Chris, I find it interesting how you phrase it right now, because you said it's a general view on human nature,
Yeah.
which is quite a demanding thing, because you have first to have a notion of human nature, and it relates back to identity, because that presumes that humanity exists as an identity category in your brain. Otherwise, you couldn't develop that sense of human nature. But I find that really interesting.
Well, I know. I think that when you're young, you learn from your parents as to how they interact with all sorts of people. Not individuals, not like you or you, but if they treat people who are different from you as equal to you, as worthy to you. So if you grow up in the United States and your parents treat black people the same as they treat white people, they see them the same way, they treat Hispanics in the same way, then you view everyone as part of your same moral universe. But if they go and they only look at Germans from Lüneburg in one way, or people who wear green shirts as one way. You see what I'm talking about? These are very easy stereotypes to get. And particularly when you're young, you can easily see if your parents make certain distinctions among different types of people.
Also how they talk about these people.
Exactly. How they talk about these people, the respect that they show. If they're voting for Donald Trump, they're probably not going to be generalized trusters.
I also wondered when you were presenting your results, some of which were unexpected, about data quality. And could you describe the data set a little bit?
Okay. Well, it was face-to-face interviews of about 2,000 people done by the bottom. And let's see,
Which year was it?
it was last year?
Last year.
2014.
Yeah.
And
That confirms my suspicions, and I will explain.
Okay.
But please continue.
okay, we chose Levada because they had
No, they have good reputation, no doubt, but.
and now I'll tell you one thing that led me to be a little bit worried even before I started doing all this analysis. We had a Muslim booster to see whether Muslims were different. And the Muslims were consistently higher in trust than were ordinary Russians. That goes against every other survey I have ever seen. And I do not use the Muslim booster in my own work, because I just find it to be so strange.
Yeah, the reason I asked this question, and it has more to do with the year of survey than with the company's name. Because 2014 was the year when the national currency, the ruble, lost half of its value. And it sort of affected the data quality, especially in the provinces.
Okay.
So, for that particular year, and maybe even 2015, because, people have to adjust to lower salaries, and they will cheat more if, they have the same amount of work to be done.
Where's Francesco?
Right. But in Moscow, maybe St. Petersburg, the data perhaps would
Work better.
better, but in Russian provinces in those years, I would have certain
Plums.
qualms. At least I would go and try to identify suspicious cases and see whether the data set could be cleansed. Unfortunately.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Unless there are other questions, let's thank Eric Uslaner.